Hold still, son. Sigrid's voice was a low, sandpaper rasp as she dabbed a steaming cloth along the fresh, jagged cut on Rayon's forehead. Somehow, almost completely subconsciously, his feet had guided him straight to her doorstep the moment the vanguard returned from the valley camp. Outside, the night still hung thick and dead along the sky, and the sleeping populace of Nostrudor did not stir. He had been thoroughly surprised to find her awake at such an ungodly hour, but as the heat of the cloth pierced his skin, he was profoundly glad. "Sorry for the late call," Rian said, his voice sounding hollow in the small room. Don't be silly, at least you were awake this time when you came through my door." She chuckled slightly, a dry sound that lacked any real warmth. Dropping the stained cloth into a ceramic bowl, she placed a fresh, small bandage along his wound with practiced, calloused fingers. He felt a sharp spike of pain, but it wasn't enough to distract his racing mind from the burning questions beginning to form in the shadows of his thoughts. "How did it go out there, then?" she questioned, not looking at him as she began packing away her jars and herbs. "Good, I think. We captured a fair amount, and the rest scattered and routed," Rian replied. He stepped off the small wooden cot he had been sitting on, crossing the floor to wash his face in a stone basin filled with cold water. He let the heavy droplets drip down over his tunic and leather vest. Both were heavily stained in a grim cocktail of sweat, dark dirt, and drying blood. Sigrid didn't pause her packing. "I am surprised you didn't just slaughter them all," she muttered passively. An uncomfortable, heavy silence immediately dropped over the room. Rayon felt a cold wave of unease wash over him at her words. She was a medicus. Her entire purpose was to heal, to preserve life. Yet here she was, coming across as casual, bloodthirsty, and cruel. She wandered back up to him, her fingers sweeping out to aggressively brush off the loose dust and battlefield grit from his shoulders. "Well, that's at least what old Zarek would say, right?" She let out a dry, hacking cough into her hands and turned away from him, facing the narrow gap in the masonry that let in a sharp beam of silver moonlight. The laugh that followed from her felt incredibly forced, rattling around her chest. The moonlight hit her features with a sudden, intense clarity. Rayon found himself staring at the severe weariness of old age written across her wrinkled face and frozen in her pale gray eyes. She looked cold. Not so much in her temperature, but as if the natural vitality had been entirely drained from her body, leaving little to no blood beneath her pale skin. He could have sworn she had seemed warmer, more human, when he first woke up. Without another word, she proceeded to slam the wooden shutters closed, completely blotting out the moon, before picking up a solitary lit candle in its iron holder from the table. "I take it you are not going to get much sleep tonight?" she spoke, her eyes tracking the flickering flame. Rian merely nodded. He was far too alert, his veins still pumping with lingering adrenaline to dare let his mind drift off and risk forgetting the chaotic sequence of events that had just transpired. In his mind, a cold logic whispered, "Okay, this must be my life now." But in his heart, a growing, unshakable concern refused to leave him. He adjusted his sheathed sword on his belt, fastening the heavy leather strap tightly around his waist, and made directly for the exit. "Try not to dwell on tonight, son," Sigrid muttered from the darkness, before vanishing entirely into one of the back rooms. Rayon stepped back into the frozen air, heading straight for the armory. "No stops this time," he commanded himself internally. "No tavern, no distractions." He took up a rigid, steady pace down the sloping stone path toward his right, following the exact route he had traversed hours ago. The winding streets were lined with flickering orange torches, some driven into the iron brackets of the surrounding masonry, others held by the occasional sentry standing guard at the dim alleyways and junctions. He found his eyes floating up into the night sky more than once, however. A strange clinical realization had just occurred to him. The clouds, they haven't moved a single inch all night. Perhaps they simply hadn't caught the wind yet, he reasoned. But as he stared at the sky, he recalled the exact cloud formation from when the cavalry had left Nostrudor. They were in the precise same shape, frozen against the black void. Taking the stone steps to the armory 2 at a time, he completed the journey in almost half the time it had taken him previously. 2 town guards were posted on either side of the heavy wooden doors. They stood so incredibly rigid they looked like statues, or perhaps they were fast asleep. Rian truly could not tell. Even when he pushed past them to enter the building, neither man reacted, their unblinking eyes staring forward into the dark. The familiar cluttered layout of the room was a welcome relief. He knew where he was going now. He knew what he was doing and exactly who he expected to encounter. And there he was, sitting to Rian's right in the same chair he had occupied hours ago. Garth sat with his head buried in his folded arms, leaning heavily against the main table. He wasn't sleeping, but rather trapped deep in a catatonic state of thought. He didn't stir or look up when the doors creaked open, a bizarre, chilling juxtaposition to the frantic, welcoming greeting he had given Rian before the raid. The armory was visibly messier than it had been previously. Iron gauntlets and mud-caked boots were scattered across the floorboards. Dirty tunics and stained garments were piled waist-high in the far right corner, but it was the sight to his left that drew Rian's full attention. Splayed out across a side table against the wall were pieces of captured equipment that clearly did not belong to his men. Elegant green cloaks, fine leather belts, a broken arrow quiver, a strange weapon that looked like a terrifying bow blade, and a beautifully ornate sword. "Can't sleep?" Garth spoke up, his voice cracking the silence without his head leaving his arms. "Yeah, too much on my mind," Rian replied smoothly, his fingers tracing the foreign object's layout. "You?" "Yep, same," Garth muttered, forcing his rigid posture to stand. He strolled over toward where Rian stood, his gaze landing passively on the spoils of the ambush. "Quite the haul," Garth said, reaching out a loose hand to lightly grasp the frame of the bow blade. "Probably caused it, you know. The bloody thing nearly killed me." He feigned a tight plastic smile in Rian's direction, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "I'm glad it didn't," Rian replied honestly, his hand shifting to take hold of the ornate sword beside it. His eyes became instantly fixated on the weapon's hilt. The intricate, delicate care of ancient, master-level craftsmanship had clearly gone into every millimeter of the metal. He wrapped his right hand around the grip. The leather wrap fit his palm flawlessly, as if it had been molded for his hand alone. Holding the scabbard with his left hand, he pulled. With a soft, metallic hiss, the sword unsheathed. Dropping the empty sheath onto the table, he lifted the bare blade before his face. "Beautiful," he whispered, the praise escaping his lips as if he were speaking directly to a living thing. Along its center line, the silver metal was etched with a dense variety of glowing, elegant symbols, though none that his fractured memory could immediately identify. He traced the length of the polished edge with his finger, the metal completely smooth. "That's a dryad blade if I ever saw one," Garth muttered from his shoulder, his eyes equally fixated on the weapon. Rian took a few paces back into the open space of the armory. Gripping the hilt with both hands, he threw off a few test swings into the empty air. The sword was impossibly light for its size, completely defying the physics of the iron longswords his men carried. His own standard-issue weapon felt clunky, top-heavy, and alien in his grasp, but this blade felt like an extension of his own arm. The sweep of the steel didn't feel practiced, it felt remembered. Suddenly, his body took over. Rian brought the blade around each shoulder in a dazzling, blinding flourish, moving faster than the human eye was trained to track. The silver blade flashed like lightning through the torchlight. Crack! The heavy wooden table in front of him split violently into 2 halves under the sheer velocity of the strike, followed a millisecond later by a ringing, melodic clang as the tip of the blade struck the stone floor beneath. Garth violently recoiled, his mouth falling wide open as he took in a sharp, terrified breath of air. Rian returned to a rigid, upright position, his chest heaving slightly as he stared into the silver reflection of the blade. Where did you learn to move like that?" Garth cried out, his voice a mix of profound impression and genuine fear at the display. I don't know," Rian replied hesitantly, his own heart hammering. As he stared deeper into the pristine steel, the flickering orange torchlight from the surrounding braziers seemed to bleed across the surface, blending the colors of gold, silver, and green into shifting, blurred lines. The vibrant visual pulled violently at a phantom memory inside his skull. It made him think of fire. Fire and crackling wood. Fire, wood, and raw, unrestrained laughter. Bang! The sudden violent bursting of the heavy entrance doors instantly snapped both Rian and Garth out of the trance. "What in the hell is going on in here?" a familiar voice barked. Varric stood framed in the doorway, his massive arms outstretched, holding both wooden doors apart. His dark eyes darted instantly to the cleanly split table on his left, and then down to the elegant dryad sword Rian still held naked in his hands. Nothing much, sir," Garth fumbled, his boots tangling slightly as he tried to nervously position his body between the two men. Rian lowered the weapon, smoothly sliding it back into the captured sheath before tightening its leather straps onto his own belt. "How are the prisoners?" he asked, keeping his tone authoritative. "Quiet. Too damn quiet for my liking," Varric spat, stepping into the room. "It's why I'm here. I figure maybe your commanding demeanor can get something out of the bastards." Varric eyed Rian up and down, his gaze lingering on the new sword, before turning a stern glare toward Garth.
"You should get this place sorted, boy. It's an absolute state."
Garth turned to face the chaotic mess of armor and boots around him. Aye, sir. I will get on that right now." He practically fled the room, exiting through a side door to the right with hasty, echoing steps. The armory went dead quiet. Rian stood a few meters from the mountain of a man. He noticed Varric was aggressively caressing his own knuckles within his palm, as if attempting to crack them or ease some deep, throbbing pain. Perhaps he had injured them during the chaos of the raid. "I take it you don't know the way down to the dungeons, sir?" Varric questioned, a strange glint in his eye. Rian shook his head silently. "I'll take you. It's not too far." Varric gestured with a tilt of his scarred head, turning to leave the armory. Rian took one final look at the remaining captured items on the table, then moved to keep pace with the large knight. As they stepped out into the corridor, Varric turned his head back slightly. "One of them keeps asking questions, specifically about you." The walk toward the subterranean levels of Nostrador was brief, but intensely oppressive. They crossed the open courtyard in under a minute, slipping through a rusted iron gate and descending a steep, spiraling flight of stone steps. Outside, the night still hung thick and dead with the dark of the motionless sky. Rian was genuinely beginning to question the concept of time itself. He felt as though every single interaction he'd had since waking dragged on for hours. By all logical metrics, dawn should have broken long ago. Yet there was only the starless night. When they reached the heavy iron threshold of the dungeon proper, Varric reached into his collar and pulled out a set of rusty keys that hung around his neck, tucked deep within his shirt. The keys shone with a rough, corrupted copper tone, the teeth of the metal looking so worn and tattered they seemed older than the fortress walls themselves. Varric rammed the key into the lock. Click. "Listen, sir. Be exceptionally on your guard down there," Varric warned, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They'll twist their words, say things to try and trick your mind, maybe even try to barter with you. They sure as hell tried it with me." Varric let out a harsh, booming laugh, which abruptly transitioned into a wet, heavy cough. He covered his mouth with his hand, and for a split second, the lantern light caught the flesh of his fingers. The hand was a sickening, bruised mix of dark red and deep purple, a coloration that seemed to fade into a pale, synthetic yellow hue at the knuckles. Lowering the discolored hand, Varric placed it firmly against Rian's shoulder, shoving him forward into the dark. "In you go, sir." The tightly packed stone steps that led to the cells felt completely endless. Rian swore they descended at least 6 flights of winding stairs, each level growing progressively darker, colder, and more suffocating. Eventually, a crude archway of jagged piled stones loomed in front of him, revealing a massive subterranean vault that reeked of rot. He caught the sharp, distinct whiff of damp, freshly laid hay mixed with the sour stench of sweat and fear. "Here, take this." Varric reached out, unhooking a nearby wall lantern and thrusting it into Rian's hand. The iron handle was scalding hot against his bare skin, but the pain was bearable. Rian held the lantern a few feet in front of his chest, scanning the meter-wide iron cells that lined the long, weeping corridor. Some were empty, others held crumpled, indistinct shapes pressed into the dirt. He couldn't tell if the bodies were dead or alive. As they neared the end of the passage, just before the wall took a sharp right turn, he saw an elf. The figure was crouched tightly into a ball, their head buried in their hands, faced entirely away from the iron bars while gently rocking back and forth. Rian paused to look at them, but Varric kept a heavy hand on his shoulder, continuously pushing him ahead. Clearly, the knight had a specific destination and a specific person in mind. Rian felt he already knew who it was, but he kept his mouth shut. Suddenly, as they brushed past the cell of the rocking man, the prisoner violently launched himself across the dirt. He slammed his body forcefully against the iron bars and outstretched a thin, pale arm, gripping the edge of Rian's gray cloak with terrifying strength. The sudden jerk caused Rian to lose his footing, stumbling backwards.
"It's you!"
the elven man yelled, his fingers tightening like iron claws into the fabric, attempting to drag Rian's cloak through the bars.
"It's you! It's you! It really is you!"
The man's frantic screeching echoed violently throughout the hollow stone chambers of the dungeon. Rian began to frantically tear at his own cloak, his heart leaping into his throat, but the prisoner's grip was unbreakable. Varric leapt forward with a low growl. Bringing his heavy iron boot down with immense force, he stomped directly onto the elf's trapped arm, pinning it violently against the stone floor. An audible, sickening crack echoed, and the man let out a piercing screech of pure agony, his fingers releasing the cloth as he recoiled into the shadows. "Go on, sir. She's just up ahead," Varric said coldly, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword in a silent, threatening manner. Turning the sharp corner, Rian caught sight of a solitary, isolated iron cell. There were no lit torches or burning braziers in this dead-end corridor. There was only a small, jagged square cutout high in the stone wall, letting in a single, stark stream of moonlight, just enough to illuminate the solid shapes within. Perched silently upon a crude wooden box was the female elf from the ridge. The pale moonlight caught her sharp, elegant features, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dirt. There was an eerie, absolute lack of color in this chamber. Everything was washed in a monochrome spectrum of grays and deep blacks. Rian stepped closer to the iron gate, slowly raising the hot lantern to flood the cell with amber light. The elf didn't flinch or move. She looked as if she had just been wiping something from her face. Tears, perhaps? Once she went still, Rian carefully placed the lantern onto the stone floor between them, casting long shadows upward, and sat down on the freezing ground, crossing his legs. Silence. Neither of them felt the immediate need to speak. Rian's mind raced, trying to formulate how to even begin a conversation, let alone what the right words were to say. What do I even ask her? He opened his mouth to finally break the tension. "Riveting conversation, I hear." Varric suddenly stepped into the chamber, moving with a strange, predatory silence that felt entirely unnatural for a man of his massive size and heavy armor. The elven woman instantly swung her head up to glare at him before turning her face away in pure disgust. Rian stood back up on his feet, leaving the lantern on the dirt to maintain the even, upward lighting. "Is that—" Rian started. "The elf girl you saw at the camp?" "Sure is," Varric boomed, the casual arrogance returning. "She has been of absolutely no help to us so far and refuses to say a single word of worth." "Isn't that right, dear?" He stepped forward, grabbing the iron gate with both hands and shaking it violently. The metallic clanging of iron bouncing off solid stone reverberated painfully through the enclosed space. She did not respond to the abuse, nor did she show even a microscopic hint of a physical reaction. As the steady lantern light began to fully illuminate her features, Rian began to notice the harrowing details of his prisoner. It hadn't been tears she was wiping away a moment ago. It was blood. A deep, nasty cut split her forehead, strikingly similar to his own fresh wound, which she herself had delivered on the ridge, trickling dark crimson drops down her cheek to pool on the stone floor. Her pale, ghostly skin was heavily dotted and flushed with deep hints of red and dark purple, the unmistakable signs of severe bruising beginning to creep into her flesh. Rian's gaze darted toward Varric's discolored, bruised hands, and then back toward the elf. He didn't want to accuse Varric of anything, not yet. He needed to extract whatever information he could from this lonely prisoner. But what exactly did he need to find out? The horrific realization hit him that he had absolutely no idea what Varric and the others actually expected him to achieve in this room. Find out the basics first, he thought desperately. Start there. Varric was actively hovering around the perimeter of the room, pacing like a caged beast and letting out the odd, low chuckle. He seemed intensely pleased with himself for reasons Rian could not comprehend. Rian found himself wishing with every fiber of his being that he were alone. The looming, suffocating presence of Varric behind him was making him feel deeply uneasy about every single word he was about to utter. "So, Adora, is it?" Rian asked smoothly. He received no vocal reply. "Can you nod, please, or give me anything?" The elven woman paused, her crystal green eyes tracking his face before she finally gave a single, slow nod of agreement. What next? Rian wondered. He had gotten a name, though it was a name he technically already knew from hearing it hours prior on the ridge. "Listen, Adora, we are not here to harm you." Rian spoke, his tone measured and gentle. Behind him, Varric let out a sharp, mocking, "Humph!" Rian snapped his head back to glare at the knight in warning before turning back to face the prisoner. He pondered for a fleeting moment. Perhaps it was a language barrier. Perhaps she truly couldn't comprehend the words they were using. "Can you understand what I'm saying to you?" He spoke slowly, realizing the tragic irony that she might not even understand the question itself.
"Course she can, boy," Varric barked from the shadows. "She was screaming out orders and whatnot during the battle. Did you not hear her?"
Rian tried to frantically recall the memory. He had only been in the fray for a short, chaotic while, and during that time his solitary encounter had been with this exact woman. But try as he might, he could not remember her muttering a single word. Adora slowly raised her head, facing her two captors fully. Her piercing green eyes completely bypassed Varric, locking directly onto Rian's face with intense scrutiny. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like a rustling of leaves. Varric instantly halted his pacing, his boots freezing against the stone. "Can you understand me?" Rian pressed again, leaning closer. "Yes." Finally, the prisoner was speaking. Finally, Rian thought, he could have a real conversation without relying on the underhanded tactics of his men. His mind immediately darkened with thoughts of Varric and what was becoming terrifyingly clear, the knight's systemic use of unprompted, brutal force to extract compliance. Rian crouched back down to the floor, placing a steady hand against the cold iron bars in front of him. He could feel Varric standing directly behind his shoulder, mere inches away. "Okay, who are you? Where do you come from?" he questioned. She looked up, her gaze shifting from Rian's eyes to the impending massive figure of the soldier looming directly behind him. "Does it matter?" she asked softly. "Yes, of course it does. If you can provide anything substantial, I can see about your release," he replied, though a hollow feeling in his stomach told him he had no idea if such a promise was even possible. Give her comfort, he thought desperately. Give her some semblance of hope. Maybe that will loosen her tongue. She did not react to the offer of freedom as well as he had hoped. Instead, she began to fidget heavily, her slender fingers twisting and tying themselves together to keep busy, her eyes actively avoiding any direct eye contact. Rian let out a heavy sigh and turned his head slightly to face Varric. "See? Told ya. A complete waste of time," Varric growled. He lunged forward, bypassing Rian entirely and slamming both of his heavy hands onto the iron gate. "Where are your people, she-elf? Where is the hidden way to your damned mountain?" the knight roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. Rian caught sight of the sudden flash of unchecked anger erupting from the knight and instantly lunged upward, throwing his weight forward to violently push Varric back a few steps. "What are you doing?" Rian exclaimed. But Varric was completely transfixed on the elf. Adora had now risen fully to her feet, her slender posture slightly bent to accommodate the low ceiling of the small cell. She was staring back at the riled-up soldier with an unyielding, dangerous intensity. Varric did not seem too impressed with being physically pushed by his general. He glared down at Rian, a dark, dangerous look crossing his features, before he spat directly onto the stone floor and adjusted his heavy iron mail. Muttering something venomous under his breath, he walked back toward the entrance archway of the cell block, aggressively catching his breath. "Is this really who you are now?" Rian snapped his head back around to face Adora. She had stepped closer to the iron bars, her face nearly touching the metal as she stared at him with those crystal green eyes that seemed to possess a faint, unnatural inner light of their own. Glistened with the wetness of fresh tears, she used her forearm to wipe her face once more. The extensive injuries upon her person became horrifyingly apparent now that she was in the light. The cut on her forehead had stopped actively bleeding, but the severe swelling around her cheekbone and jaw had tightened. Yet the sheer physical agony that would have broken a normal human didn't seem to faze her in the slightest. And then, looking at her face up close, the truth finally dawned on him. The ears, the long, elegant, pointed ears of the elves. How had he completely failed to see them when he first caught sight of her? It wasn't just a detail of anatomy. It was a profound point of cosmic importance, a recurring, aching theme that had been clawing at the edges of his mind ever since he had awoken. Adora instantly noticed Rian staring intently at her exposed ears. With a subtle, defensive maneuver, she brushed her dark hair across her face to cover them up, hiding them from his sight. At this point, Varric's sudden silence from the doorway was almost suspicious. The knight had been increasingly vocal to the point of pure annoyance, and now he was alarmingly, perfectly quiet. Rian turned his torso to face him, the ambient lantern light illuminating the side of the giant's face. "Why are you just standing there? Isn't this exactly what you wanted?" Rian questioned, his voice laced with suspicion. Varric didn't stir. He merely leaned his heavy back against the stone doorway, his massive arms folded across his chest, listening intently. Suddenly, Varric jolted his posture, a sharp movement that made Rian inherently snap his head back toward the cell. He was mere inches away from Adora's hand. She had outstretched her thin arm through the iron bars and was actively attempting to grab hold of something, or touch something, on Rian's head. Rian gasped, recoiling violently and scrambling back a few steps across the dirt. Adora withdrew her arm as swiftly as a striking serpent, her knuckles rattling loudly against the iron bars as she pulled back into the cell. "What was that?" Rian exclaimed, his breath catching. "Your ears," she whimpered, staring down at the hand she had just withdrawn in absolute disbelief. By this time, Varric was already standing directly beside Rian. His face was entirely devoid of its boisterous humor, replaced by a cold, clinical darkness. His hand was resting firmly on the hilt of his broadsword, and he was beginning to slowly, deliberately pull the steel blade out of its sheath. Rian thrust his hand out, firmly gesturing to Varric to lower the weapon. The knight hesitated for 2 agonizing heartbeats, his eyes darting between his general and the prisoner. But as he saw Adora settle back into the shadows, he reluctantly followed the command, sliding the steel back home. "What did they do to you?" Adora's voice had become so subtle, so incredibly soft, that it was nearly impossible to decipher the words. She began to frantically mutter to herself, her eyes darting around the empty cell as if she were inwardly conversing with a ghost trapped in the room with her. Rian caught fleeting fragments of her spoken babble. She would say one thing, only to immediately react to it, or violently contradict herself a moment later. He leaned forward on his knees, huddling closer to the bars to try and decipher the erratic speech, but Varric got there first. "If you are not going to tell us anything useful, then we are entirely done here. Come, sir," Varric growled, placing a heavy, ironclad hand onto Rian's shoulder to aggressively beckon him to his feet. "No, just a second, please," Rian replied, trying to shake off the grip. "Sir, I must insist." Varric's grip tightened with terrifying, crushing force, physically hoisting him up. Rian pressed his face almost completely against the cold iron bars. "Please, Adora." The woman's head instantly perked up the moment she heard her name escape his lips. "What do you know? Please, I don't know," Rian pleaded, his voice breaking. At that exact moment, the heavy atmosphere was shattered by the sound of rushing boots. One of the sentries who stood guard at the upper entrance of the dungeon appeared in the archway, his form silhouetted sharply against the distant torchlight. He was panting heavily. Varric immediately straightened to absolute attention, his hand dropping from Rian's shoulder as he turned to face the messenger. Rian scrambled back to his feet. "What is it?" Varric demanded. The guard looked at Rian, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and something unreadable, before shifting his gaze to Varric. There's something you both need to see immediately. They've come." An absolute deafening silence fell over the damp room.
"Who?"
Rian asked, his voice echoing in the vault. "Who has come?" The soldier did not respond. He merely stared. "Come, sir. I bet you must be absolutely dying for a rest or maybe even some real food," Varric said, a sudden, bizarre smile painting his face. His attitude had instantly flipped, becoming far more enthusiastic and happier than he had been moments before. He gestured toward the exit stairwell. "Let's get you out of this damp hole, and we can talk to the rest of these miserable prisoners tomorrow." The two men began to walk toward the spiraling stone stairs, the guard flanking them. Suddenly, a sharp, ragged hiss of indrawn breath echoed from the lone cell behind them. Rian stopped, turning his head one final time to face the darkness. Adora was staring directly at him through the moonlight. "They're coming," she spoke clearly, the madness entirely vanishing from her tone. Without another word, she lay down upon the freezing stone floor, turning her back to the bars to face the dead stone wall behind her.